So welcome to the second of our public lectures for the year. My name is Nick Gallant. I'm a professor in the Bartlett School of Planning, which is very close by, and it's my pleasure to convene the lecture this evening. So we've been organising these public lectures for the last 15 years or so, and they're an opportunity to bring before an audience of colleagues and students and guests speakers on topical planning issues, researchers and practitioners. And tonight we have a practitioner who can I describe you as a practitioner? Yes, I can. That's okay. I've offended nobody. Who I'll introduce in a moment. Every year we have a series of 5 lectures. Some of you will recall that we welcomed Dr. Tom Moore from the University of Liverpool here in October, who gave a talk on community land trusts. And on the website, the Bartlett School of Planning website, there is an opportunity to have a look at what's coming up and in due course to register for future events. The next lecture after Christmas will be a double act from Katie Locke and Hugh Ellis from the Town and Country Planning Association, who will speak on values in planning in January. Then in March we will have Catalina Turcu from the School of Planning provide you with an overview of the research that she is currently engaged with. Don't have a title yet, but that will be shortly advertised. And then we have every year in May a public lecture in honour of a late colleague, Professor Sir Peter Hall, and this year that will be delivered by the Mayor for the North West, Kim McGuinness, on the subject of infrastructure planning and regional development in the northwest of England. And that will happen later in May. So details of these lectures are available on our website, and if you book in advance, make sure that we get enough wine in. So to tonight's lecture, very happy to welcome Dan Ringelstein. Dan is Director of Master Planning and Urban Design at Arup's Cities Planning and Design Group. Before joining Arup 2 years ago, Dan was a principal at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, for whom he worked in Chicago for 10 years and London for 20 years. So you've been here for quite a long time. Okay. You've not lost the accent yet, but you've been here for a while. So Dan is an architect, urban designer and city planner with an interest in the physical characteristics of a place and how the planning and urban design, how the planning and design of urban infrastructure, landscape and architecture can create a positive public environment. He's worked internationally across different planning cultures throughout the world, including here in the UK, the US, Europe, Southeast Asia, the Middle East and Africa, working with communities and of course with private clients. So the talk that he's going to give this evening very much draws on that broad international experience, and the topic is Reinvigorating the Suburbs, Championing Diversity, Density and More Dynamic Lifestyles. There will be a chance to ask questions at the end. Dan's going to talk for 45-50 minutes. He has quite a few slides, but don't be perturbed. Yeah. So without further ado, Dan, welcome to UCL, and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nick. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Camera in the back, can you hear me fine? Great. Thumbs up. We're good to go. Hopefully technology will be our friend today. Well, thanks again. It's great to be back at UCL. I actually taught here for 2 years, between 2008 and 2009 at the Bartlett School. And I just worked down the street. Our Arup offices are really just at Fitzrovia over there. So I do come at this from a design-led point of view. So yes, I'm an architect, but that only lasted probably, let's say, 8 of those 30 plus years of my practice. I really moved into larger scale thinking quite early on in my career, even when I was still working in Chicago. Did a lot of work with the mayor of Chicago, which I'll show one project there. And then when I came to London, it was really looking at work in London, UK, Europe, and then I kind of from there, because London's such a great place to access the world, I've been very fortunate to work all over the globe, which has been a tremendous passage of time for me. So I'm going to walk through first a little introduction, and then I'll sort of banter through a series of themes illustrated through projects. Yeah. So I think I start this talk today really talking about the post-pandemic world, and I think we can all recognize that we are facing and have been facing unprecedented change in urban life, and in particular how we interact with one another socially. And I think some of we'll get into this as well, the geopolitical issues that are rising most recently, which I will get into, have starting to ask us all lots of questions, I think, that we really are starting to, I think, need to rethink. During COVID, people were actually challenging us as planners and designers, are cities the right mode of development as the planet grows? And I think we would all say absolutely yes, but believe you me, people were challenging us that this is the wrong model for the future because of the pandemic. And I think it's because a couple of things that happened, obviously. If you haven't seen these maps before, this is basically showing that the areas that were impacted the most by COVID were areas of lower income neighborhoods and areas not that were the most dense. On the left is density of New York City. On the right is the boroughs that were the most heavily impacted by COVID. And this is not just an American phenomenon. The same happened in Europe. These are different colors, but they're saying the same thing. This is the Netherlands, density on the left, impact of COVID on the right. So and this is also why you're getting probably lots of anti-vaxxers in these places, because they were the ones that were hit the most. But again, maybe a bit misguided based on where they get their information from. So I think this was sort of a wake-up call for many of us. I think cities really reacted well, much more than the suburbs, particularly cities that were much more diverse, much more mixed, much more vibrant. You know, London Zone 3 came alive during COVID, whereas London Zones 1 and 2 kind of died. Paris came out of COVID much quicker because it's much more mixed and much more diverse. So it was interesting kind of to see that impact of COVID and how cities were resilient. And by the way, it's not the first time cities had to address a pandemic, wasn't it? So I do think they're valid ecosystems that continue to change over time and will continue to change. So my colleagues at Arup, not me, but others, did a really nice piece about this point, about how suburbia has reacted to this sort of global pandemic. And there's a series of themes that they addressed in this work. They also interviewed a series of clients in the UK across a series of our projects, which were not just in London, but throughout the UK. And they were asking questions to these clients. Sometimes they're public sector authorities, sometimes they're private developers, like the one for White Rose is a private developer trying to bring to life a new business park. So what were the things that they were challenged with? And what were the things that they saw sort of coming out of the pandemic as potential solutions? These were 5 key points. So I'll point you to this research if you want more information on this particular piece. I'm not going to dive into too much, but clearly it's the things I think we all know about, so that the places that had a much better diversification on the high street, those high streets performed better than the ones that didn't. I think high streets are still struggling. You know, there's been a whole activity and a whole desire to retrofit our homes during COVID and also address the energy issues that we have here in the UK. The COVID pandemic allowed us to hack our streets, so it actually helped us to get out of cars and into walking and cycling and using scooters in our towns, and we were actually able to hack the public realm to make that actually happen without asking too many questions, because no one was out on the streets complaining. And there are some success stories about how governments helped to fund a lot of these improvements and how that's also helped certain communities to live on. So I think it can be said that you can intervene in these areas, and you can rethink and redesign and replan some of these suburban areas to be more resilient to this kind of a crisis, which also not only is better sustainability, but more equitable futures for people. And then, of course, we have an underlying current, right, of social disruption. And you can tell with my accent, you can probably guess for where I may be from, where I may have tended to vote in the last election. And I think well, for me, it was a complete shock, but maybe not a surprise. But we can no longer say that it was a one-off. And I think, you know, Brexit was a precursor to many places going the nationalist route. In comes Trump 2016. He was defeated later, but then here he is again. So I don't know. I have my own theories. I think the jury's still out of what happened, and I'm not going to pretend to know what the answers were, but I'm hearing a lot of anecdotal evidence. Many of you have probably heard of our kind of crazy yet rational electoral college system, and you've probably seen this map on the left, which is basically the blue versus red states. So on the left is the states that come on the one in blue and the ones that Trump one in red. But what you may not have seen in the past is the one on the right, which is basically the US House of Representatives, which is a much finer grain map of the same thing on the left. And if you kind of squint at that a bit further, you recognize it's basically cities. It's obviously the two coasts, and the rest of it are cities. Everything in between, whether it's rural or suburban. And I would love to see the same map of suburbs, what happened in the suburbs, because we know that Kamala lost the suburbs, which is always going to be a question. But particularly, she lost the woman vote in the suburbs. How did that happen, particularly with the issues of abortion in the States, with Roe v. Wade being overturned? So I think this, to me, as an urban planner, says a lot about the social dynamics of the United States, and I believe the same map exists for Brexit, very similar kind of outcome. So for me, it tells me that people in urban areas bump into other people that aren't their same race, color, creed, don't always have the same interests as they do. In the suburbs, in the rural areas, you're a bit isolated. This map was interesting. This is an interesting website. Steve Ballmer from Microsoft has started a new group called Just the Facts. This is a map that he produced. It shows in the darker colors the US population growth over the last 30 years. And you can see the Sun Belt, as I think you probably have heard. The Sun Belt sort of really pops off the page. And the decline is where? It's in the Rust Belt. It's in the cities up north. So you had this exodus from the Rust Belt into the Sun Belt. And these aren't people moving to cities. These are people moving to the suburbs. All of these growth areas are the suburbs of Phoenix, of San Diego, of Atlanta, of Dallas, of Houston. It's a huge suburban growth pattern over the last 30 years. So the US usually sets these trends, unfortunately. So if it hasn't already happened in the UK, it's coming. And I think we're also probably going to see it elsewhere. So what is life like in the suburbs? It's like this. I grew up in a community kind of like this, outside of Chicago. It wasn't gated. At least in my community, it did have sidewalks. But many of them are like this. You're isolated from the next community. There aren't even any sidewalks. You can't even walk to see your neighbor. There's no front porch. All you see are the garages. So it's all a car-based community. And then from that house, you use this to get to work or to shop. You don't walk. You don't see anybody else. Again, you're isolated in your car. And I think this is really, in my opinion, part of the reasons why there's this misinformation that is proliferated across the United States, because people isolate themselves. What do they do in the car? They listen to a Fox News host talk, or they listen to a podcast telling them what they want to hear. So I think, rubbing shoulders with people that you may not have anticipated meeting on the tube or on a bus or on the street in an urban area like London, I think does have an impact on people's attitudes. I think we all know this too. Obviously, the world is urbanizing. And that's the trend we're seeing. And in 2050, more people will be living in cities than in the country. Well, that's true, but it's actually the suburbs. They'll be moving to the suburbs, not necessarily the cities. And why do I say that? I mean, this is a cross-section of growing places around the world. And it's all suburban. So the top left is one of the new towns in France that started in the 1980s. Lagos, I'll get into a little bit later. Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam, and Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. All these places are exploding, but they're not intensifying the existing cities. They're going horizontal, they're sprawling, they're going the route of LA and Houston and Atlanta, Georgia. No transit, no communal activities except for maybe going to the mosque in Jeddah. Some good green space in some of the new towns in France, but really this is kind of a trend that I see happening all over the world. So I guess what I'm going to propose today is really how can we discuss curtailing that and actually creating a nice place for people to go if they really want to leave the city. How can they have a little bit of urbanity in these suburban areas? And what are the things that we can do to really make that a pleasant place? Now, don't worry, I'm not proposing some sort of utopian or dystopian environment like the Truman Show. In my early career, I'll show you some projects that the new urbanists were really pushing. The new urbanists did get it right in terms of planning, but not necessarily in architecture. Sort of an aesthetic that was really looking back instead of looking forward. But they did have some really good principles behind their thinking. So my talk's going to really focus on these 5 themes. And I will go through each one by one. I will show examples that are both working within existing metropolitan areas, on the edge of those metropolitan areas, and also some new towns that we've been working on across the globe, because that is still a phenomenon. This is something we don't like to do. We don't like to do greenfield development, but it is the future in these emerging markets. So we feel We have to do it to get in there to help them. We have to do it right. We have to show them, if you're going to do this, this is the way you should do it. Hopefully then we can then get in with the regional authorities to kind of make larger scale planning work better for those places. And then as Nick said, my experience is very international, so I'm going to show you how this plays out in a wide variety of places. So the focus won't be on London, the UK, I'll show you some, but it'll be across this sort of gamut of projects and geographic locations, which I think is quite interesting because the themes are all the same. The issues are all the same, no matter where you look, I think. Just how it plays out may be slightly different, but the challenges and I think the solutions are quite similar. So the first theme is really linking, how do we link these communities together in a better way? So there's not this isolation. So I think this is about intensifying and diversifying our metropolitan areas. It's really, I think, pushing for a more poly-centric model. Everything in the world is hub and spoke for the most part, maybe except for Tokyo. So we really need to make this a networked connection system so people can connect laterally, not just into the center and back out. And how then can we have more cross connections between outside areas in the city. This image below is actually from the Plateau de Saclay in Paris, which I'll explain in a minute, what they're doing there to kind of connect horizontally. So I think the first theme is really about promoting a more polycentric city, more polycentric metropolitan area. So if we look at London, I think London actually isn't bad. It's, as you all know, probably it's a series of villages that kind of grew together. So that meant each of these places, these neighborhoods, all have a focus, and that focus is usually on a train line, a market town, on a waterway. It's got a high street, it's got a little hospital or clinic, it's got some retail, maybe have some workplace environment. So it's pretty good. And the transport, if it's not rail, it's usually connected by bus, which is tremendous. But there are some missing links, and I think if we can think about London, particularly zones 4, 5, and 6, to be much more interconnected, we're using last mile transit, densifying those areas that are right on top of rail or tube interchanges. To me, that's kind of where we should be thinking in terms of growth in London. Obviously, Labour government's also looking at the green belt. They're calling it the grey belt, which is really them saying we're going to protect the green, the real green, because the green belt is not all green. A lot of it's like surface car parking lots, underutilized land, former industrial land. So what space around these cities are available to mine for more density? They actually build a lot of, they need to build 1.5 million housing units. The UK is poorly served for housing, so in order to get more affordability into the market. So I think that's a good sort of idea, but it should be connected to this idea of how you then connect those communities back to their neighbors. So if we just look at London for a minute, the London plan really identifies key areas of high levels of public transport accessibility. That's called P-tile. So these areas in blue and dark blue are measuring the areas that are within a 5-minute walk of some form of transport. And if there's more than one means of transport, that level goes up from 0 to 6. On the right is the London plan's areas of regeneration. And those areas of regeneration proposed are logically within those areas that have better. So that's, I think, a tremendous place for London to go. And we use this when we talk to people in Ho Chi Minh or in Riyadh. This is the model you need to produce. You have to create a rail system. You have to put your land use policy in parallel with a public transport strategy. Usually they're siloed. The rail guy and the road guy doesn't talk to the land use team. So they have to work hand in hand, and that's what the London plan does quite well. But when you look at the outer edge of the city, it's a bit dark, this one, but you can kind of tell that the redder the color, the more car usership you have. So basically zones 5 and 6 are heavily used. The trips are heavily car. Actually, 2/3 of people in that area use their car once a day. And that's just because there's no other choice. There's no other choice in many cases. So how can we hack this? How can we address this issue? And I think, London it's planning itself well. It's sort of been able to take over freight lines to create the overground system, which is kind of creating an inner loop. Crossrail 1, finally, it's open. It's amazing, I think. It does another job, but it still is kind of a hub and spoke. So, London keeps reinventing itself and creating more opportunities for transit, which is really good. But there's some more to be done. So when you look at this map, this again is all the rail lines, tube and rail lines going into the core. You see there's a series of gaps in the system. And that's usually in this area that people are using their cars, so no surprise there, right? So I think what London needs is more of these in many cities. Chicago, where I grew up, saying All these cities, this is a problem across all metropolitan areas, most metropolitan areas, is these transversal sort of connections, these circumferential connections that it doesn't have to be a full loop, it can just be partial loops to connect 3 or 4 of these communities together, because then I can live there and work there and not have to travel all the way in to work, which I think will help take pressure off of the center and make these places out here more livable. So one example of that is a project we did for the GLA. They came to us because they built this rail line between Wimbledon and Croydon and no one was using it. So they said, why is this not happening? It's because it's across the River Wandle, which, I turned this map 90 degrees, north is that way. So this is Wimbledon here and Croydon's down at the south and the right. And along this corridor where they built the rail line, you have a series of 10 or 12 or 13 industrial areas or big box retail areas. So they thought this would be a great catalyst to get development going here. And so there's a rail line that kind of pops through and the river that also brings other opportunities along it as well. So we started looking at one of these with Savills, and we began to interrogate sort of who owns these properties, what's happening in those things. It's a mixed bag, but it's mostly easy stuff to sort itself out. So there's logistics. So Amazon has something there. There's this one has a B&Q. There's a bus depot for the local council. There's small and medium tenants. There's only a couple really big ones. So it's fine grain, which makes it quite difficult in terms of ownership. So that's probably one of the things that's holding it back. Also, the developers who own these logistics hubs, they just sit back, 15-year lease. They're cashing their money in. It's usually going to REITs in the US. And so it's really hard to convince them to redevelop those sites. So there's a problematic issue here relative to ownership. But we were theorizing that could you create a more mixed model where you don't get rid of the employment, you actually intensify it, and you also add housing. So next to the rail station, maybe intensify and create a hub. So we're looking at typologies of stacking some of those employment uses. So put logistics at the bottom, because you'll have many deliveries. As you go up the building, it could be much more maker spaces, co-working, co-making spaces. And you could even imagine if it's clean down there, it could actually have housing above it as well. And just on that site, we were able to more than triple the amount of jobs that were there today on a smaller footprint. Yes, you'd have to go vertical, and also releasing land for housing, just clean and simple housing near the transit station. So we were looking at sort of this new mixed-use development model, and others are looking at this kind of idea as well, not just us at the time. Where it could be kind of a funky place to live and work. You could live above and have your workshop below. You could have some retail there. You could have big spaces even below grade or at grade that you need to do what you need to do in terms of knocking metal around or 3D printing materials to then fabricate into a larger piece of something. But things like bakeries and other model shops and things could also could be integrated within this world with a mixed sort of office and live workspace above. So that's the corridor today. The Port Tram is in a nice Greenway corridor, but it's kind of lost and disconnected to the area around it. So the idea is to really bring these two things in communication with one another. So the challenge here again is really working with the owners of these industrial lots, these logistics sites, and see what could be done at a finer grain to move them along. Shifting across to Paris, I think back in the 1980s, they did an amazing job of creating these 3 new towns outside of Paris. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but they basically decided to move some of the government functions in these new towns to help decentralize the government activities in the core and also help to generate some economic activity in these suburban areas. Not only did they do that, they built transit to it. So the RER system, RER A, B, and C, connects these places to the core directly. So I think architecturally and from a character point of view, some of them are much better than others. Saint-Quentin is a much nicer place than I think Marne-la-Vallée, but Marne-la-Vallée is now going through a new renaissance. So it's being rethought, re-intensified. But these are really good examples of how you create a real far satellite town. These are real satellite towns. These are not part of the agglomeration of, let's say, Paris and its suburban areas. It's sort of a step further. But these areas are also out in the middle of agricultural lands, in some cases, beautiful countryside. And these are the kinds of comfortable suburbs that they were developing and that exist now, and they have a commercial core, usually a shopping center. This one has a university in the center, and the housing's at a very low density scale, but the landscape is done really well. And it's a very walkable place. So that's a good example, I think, of how to do a suburb well. In Paris itself, I think everyone knows of La Défense, which is their version of Canary Wharf. I think Canary Wharf is much better. But again, La Défense has also reimagined itself. It was a much more mixed place than Canary Wharf and Isle of Dogs, but I think that's caught up. And now La Défense is looking to kind of re-identify itself, because it really has become a place that they're struggling to get talent and companies to move there. But what has been interesting to see is what's happened behind La Défense in Nanterre, which is this axis that keeps going, the axis of infinity, which actually goes all the way to Cergy-Pontoise. And these neighborhoods are, again, workplace neighborhoods, mixed neighborhoods, university neighborhoods. And they're really at a density at a European scale, but not at the sort of La Défense scale, so very walkable, very comfortable human scale. And there's a program, sort of last mile transit system, which has been built half the way down this corridor to get you to the main station, which is underneath the arch. And then this is another station here, which is just one stop past the arch. So it's, again, transit-oriented development. During the Arab Spring, the president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, was dealing with lots of unrest in this peripheral zone around Paris. The northeastern edge is where most of the African immigrants were coming. The southeast area here is where most of the Arab immigrants were coming. So there were really important, very difficult social issues happening in those districts. And it was really much a story of the haves and have-nots. So he created an initiative called the Grand Paris, which later then was taken on by the next mayor, Mayor Delanoë, and then now Anne, the new mayor, and the current mayor, and in a project called Reinventer Paris, to reinvent Paris. And in this case, they brought in a new light rail system that goes now, it was first here and up there. Now I think it's going all the way around, or programmed to go all the way around this peripheral zone, which has provided better accessibility. And you're seeing a lot more businesses now coming into these locations where before it was all about being in the center or out at La Défense. They also have a series of trophy projects, which I think in some cases have gone too far. This is the Ministry of Justice that Renzo Piano did. A very nice building, but that creates a nice connection across. But some of them were also urban projects like this one, to try to cross over the périphérique to create a new district that has a window to both the suburb and the city. So we were part of one of these projects. We won this developer competition with Bouygues Immobilier in this project called Charenton-Bercy. The site is quite challenging, as are most of these sort of edge of city sites. It's right here in the middle. It's about a 20-hectare site caught between the rail line, that's the RER, and the high-speed rail line that goes into Saint-Lazare, the motorway, and then the périphérique that comes across. And it was a center of logistics and a logistics hub. So the idea here is really to reconnect this part of the city that was sort of lost in between these pieces of infrastructure. And one of those bridges, we were actually able to create a new rail station. There was a gap in the RER, so we were able to promote and propose a new station to the north, and potentially in the future bridges even over the Seine, and then bridges underneath the périphérique. So this is a mixed-use development. It's residential-led, but it's really a third. It's a third resi, a third office, and a third sort of shopping. It had primarily a Parisian scale, but again, the marker of the tall buildings, quite contentious in Paris, but this was a new program of sort of height at the perimeter to kind of re-establish markers around the perimeter of the city. And then a whole series of important public realm enhancements. The bridge is more of a place, not just a connection, that brings you into the district from the station. Community spaces, neighborhood gardens, schools in the middle of the district. A high street that really performed like a proper, there's an existing shopping mall on the site. So demolish the shopping mall, get it back into a high street situation where you have retail on the ground floor leading you through the district with either office or residential above. And an innovation district cluster in the core right next to the périphérique that could also sort of celebrate the creative industries in this case. What's been happening even more recently now, and that project's got planning approval now moving forward. I think they're going to start building the first phase very soon. Now there's the next generation of thinking in Paris is called Grand Paris Express. So you can see the center of Paris here in the sort of the darker color, and so you have the light rail there. There's a new ring called Line 15, which is a new metro, which will circumnavigate. I don't know how long it would take. No one ever used it the whole way, but it's this connection through, as I was describing. And the government is building this and sponsoring a series of 50 rail stations in each of these areas, some by very famous architects. And they're also promoting at each of these stations transit corridor development. Not massive scale, but kind of bring along with the new mobility areas of densification. And then out here in the Plateau de Saclay, which is basically where the Polytechnic is, areas of research and development for Renault, for Bouygues Construction and others, to have yet another line that would connect from the high-speed rail line at near Orly and Massy-Palaisieux, which takes you to Bordeaux, and Saint-Quentin, which I showed before, a connection, another lateral connection even further out, that would connect this emerging innovation district on this agricultural plateau. I think that's the longest of the 5, so I know I got till another half an hour. Great, so mixed-use communities. I think as we work in these areas and we think about those non-mixed American examples, I think, again, just looking at the UK as an example of mixed communities that lie outside of the core as a great model for everyone, not just the UK, to follow. So it's really about increasing urban intensity to create more critical mass. I think there's the work from home phenomenon that we've seen post-COVID. How can we embrace that and create employment hubs for people to maybe not work at their house, but they're working near home in a hub where they're working with other people in the sort of business environment. And then also, obviously, diversifying the kinds of retail and experiences and services. And as well as we saw with COVID, what's the healthcare opportunities that the high streets can sort of offload some of the critical facilities in hospital, less critical things in hospitals. And we think if we got a COVID shot, we probably didn't get to have it at a hospital. You probably had a clinic, or I think I had it at a tennis center in my town. So you don't have to have all of your care taking place in a hospital. It could happen on the high street in a shop, one-stop shop. So I think for me, this is all about the concept of the 15-minute town. I credit this, I know there's many people taking credit for it, I credit this really with, the mayor of Paris was the first one to use it. She used this as her re-election campaign, the Ville d'un Cadre. And it was really, this was publications that were part of her campaign promise to really create a more balanced mixed community in Paris at the time, and to reinvigorate these neighborhoods. Paris, again, in the outer arrondissement, it's very similar to London. It's not the same scale. But those neighborhoods struggled more because there's much more residential focus. I'm going to walk you through now how this plays out in Africa. So I've been working there now for the past 8 or 9 years across these five or so projects. Each one is very much a satellite town or an edge of city town. And all the principles I've been talking about, we wanted to really pull through. So the first one's in Nairobi, Tatu City. It's to the north, in an area that's quite affluent. In northeast Nairobi, very far from the city center. So this is really about creating a new destination. There's about 5 million people that live in that area. So it's really about creating a new sort of satellite town center up in that area. So it's about 2,000 hectare project. We worked on the 300 hectare CBD of the center of town. Again, trying to promote more urbanity, more mixed use, workplace environment, streets as streets, not as roads, because all these places are building roads for cars and for trucks. So just to get them to think about a sidewalk condition and street trees and a curb that's a sidewalk that's only 5 meters instead of setting back is really difficult. But we had a great client who was really wanting to bring the best practices internationally to this place. A previous developer had proposed the Mall of Africa here. So we were also up against all the things that we saw in the 1970s here in the US. Let's have a suburb where I can drive my car, I can go to the shopping mall, and then I'll drive over here to my office building, I drive over there to the industrial area. So we're really fighting all these forces of evil, I call it, but promoting a much more urban and urbane sort of approach to the retail. So it's much more of a district model, more pedestrian focus. And Kenyans and all Africans walk everywhere. Okay, they can't afford a car, but they're very happy if the climate is controlled. And Nairobi is beautiful. It's like the same weather as Santa Monica, California, same profile. So if you protect them at noontime, protect them from the rain, people will walk everywhere. Another project, same client in Nigeria, in Lagos. If you don't know Lagos, it's going to be bigger than New York City by 2050. Nigeria would be bigger than the United States by 2050 as well. This is the biggest city, and the whole city here is really kind of screwed. It's so congested and so difficult, hard to get transport in, no further growth, lots of informal settlement. So the future of Lagos is going east along this entire peninsula. At the end of the peninsula, you have a new port and the future airport coming here. So this is the future growth of the city. I think it's 17 million today, and it's going to be over 35, 40 million by 2050. So huge urban migration. Lagos really is the window to all of West Africa. So this is the place where all the world will come to do trade with West Africa. That's how they see it. So we were talking about creating a satellite city to the east that would complement Lagos and connect it together. So we were looking at not just our site, which was in red there, but a whole strategy for the end of that peninsula that would lay in place a larger idea of a city that could have a series of different neighborhoods at the end that could have it be autonomous, could have its own sort of mix of employment and housing and industry, because we're close to the port. So this project's about the first phase of this is 1,000 hectares. It'll kind of grow in 4 phases. Half of it's really this industrial zone, sort of building the country out, but then a mixed-use district to the north along the edge of the lagoon. And again, here we are trying to create a sense of urbanity in the center of this place, their own CBD. Green space, corridors for stormwater. It's very flat, very susceptible to flooding. So thinking about the natural systems coming through, but also transitioning from that kind of urbanity to the industrial zone with typologies and places for work that could really support a contemporary lifestyle and a bit of urbanity, but also celebrating the landscape of the place, which is pretty outstanding. In Morocco, we're currently working on 3 projects. This is one of them for a different client. And this is this first one is really a satellite town between Marrakesh and Casablanca. It's part of and near to an existing town called Ben Guerir. And we came at this after they've already started building the first phase, which is university. So a new polytechnic school, which the client is building for the country. And they're mining the talent of all of Morocco and also offering scholarships from kids from Africa to come here to learn science, healthcare, engineering, technology, architecture, et cetera. So this was the first phase of the project, which was the university. It's about 75% completed. And our remit was to take that as a nucleus to a new town that would sort of envelope itself around that edge, around that campus. So the campus is the core driver, which in this case is fantastic because most new towns don't have that kind of engine for growth. So we were promoting a need to create a new centrality, a new kind of urban core that could be in close proximity to and also help the campus expand into that area. And this side, they had already started building a tech park, so a place for more research and development and perhaps even more clean industries to the east. And then to the south would really be a neighborhood, series of neighborhoods. So we're still really in the process of working this through, but creating a town center that flows from a station, future station where I'm standing, all the way through to the university at a scale that's, again, quite dense for that part of the world. Not as dense as Casablanca, but at that part of central Morocco. And the idea is to have a mix of uses, housing, hospitality, workplace, and have the campus kind of infuse itself into the city center. Right now, the campus is very much a siloed environment. And we've been talking with the client to really take the trends we're seeing now across the world where campuses are really breaking boundaries and tearing down those fences and walls around the edge of their campus and trying to merge with the city around them. So we see this strong potential dialogue between research, future campus work, and the existing campus nearby. And then have a place, a heart that beats, after school's over. We have to they were trying to attract international professors. Maybe some of you will get a call. And you need to have a place to go afterwards. The students need a place to live. They'll have more live after school, and they'll have more choices in the future, I think, even in Morocco. So that's an important thing to attract the right kinds of students, the right kinds of academics. Okay, third chapter, really it's about walkability. And again, just in the UK, when you look at these outer outer areas of our metropolitan areas, these are the kinds of things we're fronted with. These industrial areas that I mentioned before, retail parks, even town centers that once had a really great environment are now mostly rung by dual carriageways and roundabouts that really create an anti-pedestrian environment. So I think this is really about prioritizing people over the car. It's creating more urbanity in the suburbs. I think I mentioned this before, transforming streets and so you have more physical space for people and less for cars. And obviously creating places that are more comfortable, particularly in hot climates. So this project I started in 2005, not too long after I came, Lima Peninsula, which was a former industrial site on the Lee River, as the Lee River hits the Thames. And this is all about connecting this area, redeveloping the housing-led project, mixed use, but mostly housing, connected it to Cannington Station to the north with the pedestrian bridge. And because of its poor access by cars, it was great, because then we could really promote this 100% pedestrian place that everyone hopefully would come from the north, from that train station. And now over time, Cannington Station has actually had more service than it did previously when we first started. So this is really about creating a really urban kind of place out here in the Lee Valley. This is way before the Olympics. This was before even Stratford and before what's happened at Greenwich Peninsula more recently. So this was kind of much two or three times the density that was typically happening out in Newham and Tower Hamlets. But it's also about creating places for people and for families, open spaces within the project that were day lit and had sufficient access to sun and comfort, and obviously rethinking the edge of the site that promoted work places for people. And they were fortunate to get the English National Ballet to come to create an anchor, their cultural anchor right in the middle of the peninsula, which creates a good event thing happening in the middle of the island from time to time. Back to the US suburbs, I think this is a project 1998, 2000 kind of time frame. As I said, kind of the time when the new urbanists were really pushing their agenda in terms of working against these kinds of things in the suburbs. These are all in Orlando. So gated communities, single-family housing, big lots, not much public open space. Maybe there's a golf course, that's not public, you have to pay to play, that kind of thing, and no kind of community presence. So we had, in this case, a really strong leader in the Department of Planning of City of Orlando who wanted to change all their codes and use this project to change their codes, both in terms of development codes as well as codes for streets and right-of-ways. So this is the site to the east. Downtown Orlando is really right here where you see this dense sort of pack of buildings and sort of a nucleus up there. So it was really, it was a donut in the hole of the city because it used to be a naval training center. So this is part of a series of base closures that happened in the United States back in the late 90s. While there was no ships or airplanes, it was a major sort of military fenced-off zone. And it had captured these 3 or 4 lakes in them, which were part of a much wider ecosystem that had been cut off over time. So our goal was to help the city transfer this over to a private developer, our client, who's actually the Pritzker family. You may know the Pritzkers. And develop this into a new town. That sort of blended with and connected back this place into the wider community of Eastern Orlando, but in a way that promoted this sort of walkability. So it was very much a grid of streets that fed from the grid of streets around it. Walkable blocks, which means every 80 to 100 meters, you have a choice to turn left or right and walk and cycle these streets. And buildings that really push their front door to the street edge. Usually in the States, you have a 30-foot setback, big lawns, parking garages. So this is really about pushing the density of a suburban neighborhood, very small lots, very small streets, but then you got these open spaces, these neighborhood parks nearby that were where you would actually congregate together. So again, depressing the car, promoting people first. And there still is cars everywhere. Every house has a double two-car garage, but it's on an alley. Like many of the traditional suburbs of cities in the United States, they're all alley-fed like this. You can still have your car, and they're quite pleasant places, but the idea is you really are using the front of your house more often than the back. Back to Morocco, we're taking a lot of these ideas then forward. The client wanted to create a series of green boulevards, and we were able to then sort of frame them in a way that connected the new city back to the existing city, as well as embrace the wind corridors which come from the north. And our idea was actually to make them not boulevards for cars, but boulevards for people and public transit. So the major boulevards that I just showed in green are bikeways, walkways, linear green spaces, and public transit corridors. And the streets alternating these boulevards would be the ones that you would use your car. So these would really promote more connectivity with more sustainable means of transit. And they love this idea, and this would be quite unique as an approach, particularly there. They're still very much emerging. I think they're probably one of the stronger markets in North Africa, if not the strongest. So they're looking for these new models to kind of differentiate their country from others that, like Egypt's going, I think, quite the wrong direction, if you ask me, in their approach to new communities. Again, I think COVID taught us that people really want and love to engage with nature. I think there's a sort of new revelation and a newfound adoration for green spaces. So really infusing that into our thinking at this larger scale of the city metropolitan area and this suburban thinking. So enhancing natural systems, creating more biodiversity, wildlife habitat, which also then promotes, I think, a better health style, better lifestyle in terms of more healthy living. So again, this is New York City, and even here, every space of open space was precious at that time. And I think we learned that quite a bit. And I think that's very much infusing not only our thinking for communities, but also the workplace environment, where you're seeing people revolt against meetings in a conference room or a conference hall and having an opportunity to meet with their colleague outside or on a balcony. So we're seeing this sort of transform things. This is the other Army-based closure in the States I mentioned, similar to Orlando, at the same time, late 90s. This was a former air station in this case, right in the middle of a suburb. So the suburb had grown, the air station came first. Chicago was way down there. So the air station came way out in the middle of nowhere, and the city grew up around it. So this was, again, another hole in the donut. And the idea was then to transition, once this was given back to the city again, a client here was the city, to develop a new neighborhood around in the middle of their town. In the center of this, we had to deal with stormwater. It's a very flat area. It was actually a piece of former prairie. And so the idea here was to create a natural lake that became the entire stormwater capture of the entire community in this one water body. The idea was that once it was built, it would feel like it was always there. So this is about 25 years ago now. It's really starting to mature into its own place. It's really a popular place. There's also lots of recreation. We also worked with local kids to develop a children's garden. This was a really fun exercise where they came and they drew a castle garden. They drew a trellis for their parents to sit in swings while they were able to go play in the gardens. And this is also connected to a new middle school. For something very different, going all the way over to Southeast Asia. Here they're dealing with, again, tremendous urban migration, lots of sprawl. This is a project in Da Nang, which is right in the middle of the country, on a very sensitive sort of waterway, the Kudai River, which is one of the major rivers that floods horribly. This is part of a zone of farming today, rice farms, which actually would then be quite inundated. So this is about raising the land up in a sustainable way, using the old water courses that were on site throughout the course of the project, and mixing densities, creating some urbanity, but even in that case, also creating a city center, a wide range of housing types, both affordable and sort of higher end, but also making sure that throughout the sense of green was infused throughout the project, even in the most urban areas. Back to Nigeria, this is a project to the north of Abuja, one that's on the limit of whether we should have done it or not. I'm actually happy this is not going forward, this project, but we were challenged to come up with a strategy for the city, for this area near the big reservoir. And this is a very difficult moving terrain with incredible forests, valleys, and these granite domes, which are geological formations that are very unique for that part of Africa. So we began by sort of mapping all those natural constraints, not with a sort of abstract idea of how the form of the city should be, but what is nature telling us it should be relative to topography, specimen trees, waterways. And we came up with sort of an area, a diagram where you could not build versus where you could build. But then we said, the value of this place is all in its picturesque qualities. You're looking across this landscape, and all you see is the landscape. So we said, no development should ever be built on a peak. It should be all in the valleys. And that then drove, and that with the three-dimensional model we had for the site, that then drove the plan. So as a top-down plan, it's not sexy, it's not formal, it's kind of weird, actually. But it's all driven from a bottom-up approach to developing the plan in 3D with the topography. Again, protecting and maintaining the lower levels of the valleys to be these watercourses that would be maintained. They're there today, enhancing them, bringing people down close to them. And then this is largely a single-family neighborhood. It had a city center. It was the first image I showed, but making sure that as we're working on these slopes to work with topography so that the development is stepping down and not creating an overabundance of infrastructure that's going to cut through that terrain in a negative way. And again, back in Ben-Gurir, there's a series of wadis, which they call talvegs. They're dry riverbeds that flood at a major rain event, but they're mostly dry throughout the course of the year. And this, for us, became a framing element for a community where a neighborhood, a lower density neighborhood, could really come together around this with schools, a little bit of higher density node, a mosque, neighborhood center, and then housing around it. But then just accept that this natural system runs through, provide walkways and cycle lanes, but just keep it really natural and enhance it where you can, as the focus for this greenway or brownway, as it were, that cuts through the development along the south. And again here, back to Wimbledon Croydon, again, this waterway is quite an engineered sort of canal, but that doesn't say it couldn't be naturalized, made more green, to create places to bring people back together. Okay, last piece. We like to think about this work as also being local to the place. And we want to be able to capture the spirit of that place. And when we come at these international locations from afar, we really rely on, well, our observation skills, but also teams on the ground that collaborate with us. So local architects, local landscape architects, local planners that really tell us about the past, the significance of the past of a place, and how we can sort of take that as an inspiration. So we've been working a lot in Jeddah recently. So this Jeddah is an amazing sort of very different kind of city along the coast of the Red Sea. It's a trading town. This is the old city, which has similar cities like it up and down the coast of Jeddah, of the Red Sea. It's a place where the Orient came to the Middle East. So it's a place where lots of craft, different kinds of materials came. This old city is built out of coral stone because that was the local material that was available, and it's very sustainable in terms of its self-shading, which creates also because of its organic nature, there's no planning here. It's a very interesting kind of fabric to discover. There's also the social aspects to this place, which is very different from other places in Saudi Arabia, because it has this occidental and this international feel. The community there is very international, actually. It's also a seafront town. Yeah, it's very different from a desert town. So yes, it's in the desert, but it's also on the sea. And where the sea meets the desert can be quite a special place. And again, this sort of craftsmanship and influences from the wider world that came to Jeddah as people were traveling into the Middle East or to the holy sites is really relevant and prevalent in their architecture. So the thought of detail, a shade and shadow, and the color of the place is also quite interesting. It's really driven from the natural environment primarily. So we were working on a new project, part of the extension of Jeddah to the north, called New Jeddah Downtown. This is a competition, so we were taking inspiration from the coral structures, the old city, to create a new fabric for the town in plan. And that would be we thought could be both referential to the natural systems that are right on the site. We have coral reefs right on the edge of the project boundary, but also the way in which you would experience this place. So we were inspired by oil paintings of old Jeddah, and how that could really influence our thinking from the old to the new, to creating pedestrian spaces that were well shaded, to draw you from one space to another, and a sequence of places. And in an agglomeration of buildings along the waterfront, we're as informal as the old city, but in a contemporary way. And we're working on a town further to the north. And here, again, working with a local architect who's been doing these analysis of different fabrics within Jeddah. The remit here was not to mimic old Jeddah, but to think about all of Jeddah as an inspiration. So they've been helping us by mapping different neighborhoods, the character of the fabric, how that can be abstracted, both from a very intensive, informal way down to a much more simplistic way. And how could that inform our city center that we're building in the middle of this town? So moving from more of a Cartesian sort of Western grid into something that's much more referential to the place. Now, it's contemporary development. It has to be efficient. We have to use building typologies that are very different from those of the past. So it has to be rationalized, but it can still have a level of informality to it, we feel. So you can still have a sense of discovery in some places, yet still be very rational in terms of the building fabric itself. The developer here is also running in parallel with our master plan. This is quite interesting, our architectural design competition, to establish the language of the place in terms of architectural character, look, and feel. And these architects are coming together with some interesting approaches to their own way of interpreting the city. And I have a favorite. It's still not finished, but one in particular has really gone into the details in an incredibly beautiful way in terms of interpreting patterns, color, breezeway blocks, et cetera, into the architecture in terms of also animating the ground floor plane of these places. So getting a bit maybe nerdy in the architecture side of things, but I think it's part of this question of bringing value to these places. We did this as well as in Kenya. We were really, with our local team, understanding, we had actually a series of students, planning students, who helped us sort of understand the place from their perspective, from a young generational point of view. So they collected all this imagery and a series of principles for us. And that sort of fed into a language of architecture and places that we're trying to celebrate, yet in a contemporary way, the sort of color and vibrancy and landscape of the place in a way that felt very bespoke to that location. And the last project really, I was very lucky to have been involved in the master plan of Millennium Park in Chicago before I left Chicago to come here. This is with the mayor after many other projects with him. And this is back in 1998, same time. But really so we created a framework. Framework for what? Well, for performance, for people, for recreation, but also for the art. And I think the really powerful piece of this project is the art itself and the way in which the art reveals the place, but also the people. So, and this really truly is a melting pot for the city of Chicago. And I've seen an incredible transformation of downtown just through this project. People from the suburbs are coming in. People from the poorest areas of South Chicago and North Chicago and West Chicago are coming in. And people are really intermingling, and particularly with this play fountain, it's the kids that are mingling together to see one another, to just be aware that there's other people out there than maybe the ones that they're experiencing in their daily lives. I think this is the tremendous success of these art pieces in Millennium Park, to bring people together in new and inviting ways. And there I'm done. Happy to take questions.
So that was absolutely perfect timing. Does Donald Trump realize that planners and urban designers will defeat him with density, do you think? I mean, that's very good news for today.
I doubt it.
Do we have any questions? The urban designers amongst you will have plenty, I'm sure, but everybody else as well. If you've been at these events before, you will realize that I am the roving mic, yeah? So I will come over and give you this so you can ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was brilliant. I'm wondering about the role of the local centers, these new centralities, potential new centralities, activity hubs in these areas around the cities, in particular the new towns that are being built. Which type of considerations have you been taking for creating these areas? Are they part of, I don't know, are you making sure they are part of a bigger system of centralities? And how much room there is for adaptability as well in those? Because as we know, with the economy, they may be shrinking or needing to expand at some point. So yeah, how much room there is for adaptability as well in those?
Yeah, great question. In a lot of the projects, a lot of the clients come to us with a site and they say, I've got this incredible piece of land. What can I build here? So they ask us to do a master plan, and many people do this plan for them as well before we get there. We have to then come and pick up the pieces because it didn't work. They lay out a plan that shows them the capacity of the site to deliver something. What they're not looking at is the economic underpinnings of these things. So the biggest challenge in all these projects is the employment offer. So what is the catalyst that's going to bring jobs there? Then people may move there. But the further away they are from any employment destination, the more challenging it's going to be to create a there, to create activity there 24/7. So we always try to promote a high-level economic study. What are the catalyzers there that you're creating or nearby? What little sort of elements of nuggets can be pulled together to create more critical mass? Because a lot of times they've got something over here and over there. Let's pull that together, create critical mass, day one. What is it? Does it have an identity? Is it research on pharmaceuticals? Is it agriculture-based research? So create something that has an identity to start something, and then maybe you can create a nucleus. But that is the biggest challenge. The towns that have the universities in the middle have it much easier. The ones that don't are the ones that really have a difficulty. And we've done other projects that have, like industrial cities. Well, they have the port, industrial port, so fine. They get that going, but you really can't get a community going there because it's not the right kind of intensive employment. So it's often a missed thing, and I think that would probably also be the case for Zone 5 and 6 in London too. What are the economic clusters that one could create that would have enough critical mass to create more intensity?
So there's been a focus on the Wandle Valley for a very, very long time. I lived there 25 years ago, and it was identified in, I think, the first iteration of the London Plan as an opportunity area. What's actually happened there?
Nothing.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
The rail lines happened.
Yeah.
But not any, if any, of those industrial. Well, they're not all industrial sites. They're logistics park. They're industrial parks, but they're not heavy industry. They're light industry. They're forgotten territory because the people who own it, sometimes there are three big landowners that own the majority of them. They just are happy to sit back, and as I said, they have long-term leases. It's just bankable because that company's not going away, and there's no interest in them to kind of redevelop or intensify it. So but the residential developers we talked to were very interested in that area. But getting them to team with the landowners was very difficult because the landowners were, well, I've got a good thing going here, why would I change this formula? So that's the ownership was the thing that we saw was the biggest barrier to delivering what we were showing.
Okay, so land ownership is the biggest barrier. And what can we do about that? I have a question over here, so I'm just going to wander over here. There you go.
Thank you, Nick. So my question is, how do we scale this, especially politically, right? Because you mentioned, for example, Jeddah. For every development of the type that you said there are 10 completely car-dependent, dead, gated neighborhoods, right? In London as well. Most of outer London still looks the way it did 50 years ago or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
What's the political reality of this, and what happens when specific clients don't come forward with sites, and instead we as a society need to figure out how to reinvigorate the suburbs?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think it's got to be more top-down planning at a regional metropolitan scale that also looks at things more holistically. In Saudi Arabia, all these things are project-based, and none of the project teams are talking to one another. So when you do 3 or 4 of these projects, you realize they have the same program. And then you ask the question, well, I just did this project down the road. It has the same program as you. So are you sure your hotels are going to outcompete these guys? Because you have the same number, same type of hotels. Okay, yes, they need hotels. Everyone feels they need a lot of things, but there's going to be some limit to that. And no one's looking at things from a macroeconomic point of view, what the actual profile is of where their economy's going, where do you focus prior to areas of economic activity around the country. Obviously, tourism is a no-brainer for them. From a certain point of view, they still will struggle to get international tourists, I think, but they'll definitely have regional tourists, which is underprovided market there in Saudi. But yeah, it's a challenge. So we're just starting conversations with the Jeddah Development Authority on our project, and I find they're being quite reactive. Their role is to be much more directive, but they're being more reactive than directive. So it's a big challenge. Yeah.
Good evening. About 15 years ago, I was with some planning friends in Spokane in eastern Washington. And they were involved in a reinvigoration of something called Sprague Avenue, which you may have heard of. I think it's about a 20-mile-long sprawl from Spokane going east. And they brought in consultants. They wanted to essentially create a new downtown and introduce sort of European-style squares and shops, etc. And they proceeded down this road, and they got quite far advanced with it, until it then went to the public. And as soon as the sort of vested interests in the area got hold of it, the concept or the issue or the ideology of property rights was invoked. I just wonder what what your experience has been from the States about how these ideas come up against property rights and what the outcome is.
I don't know much about the property right issues. I know that typically with these projects, we'll get a lot of NIMBYism. They're worried about devaluation of their property next door, which actually wouldn't be the case. Their property actually value will go up, not down. And they're always issued about traffic. Oh, this thing's going to bring all this traffic. So they usually are revolting against car traffic. So you have to sort of tell the story that a certain percent of these trips will be local, and they'll be on bike and walking, and we're trying to address the traffic issue. But it is a challenge because there's no public transit in these places. Even the bus system is quite lowly. That's what I've experienced, is really only people who have lived in cities are going to be looking for those kinds of things. Oh yeah, I remember when I grew up as a kid, going to my grandparents who lived on a street that had an alley. We would play in the street, you'd be totally safe, there's no cars. So it took people who were city dwellers who then moved to the suburbs because there's a better life for them and their families. But then they were missing the city life that they had back. That my parents kind of fell into that category. They kind of hated, they moved to the suburbs because that was their opportunity. But when they got there 20 years later, they're like, I can't talk to, I have no neighbors I can talk to, I have no sort of communal social life. So they really had to make an effort to kind of do that. So it's popular for some people. It's a very small segment of the population in the United States, I think. Yeah. But it is changing. I think it's funny. My brother and my cousins looking for a new house. Oh yeah, I want to look for a house that's in a community that's got sidewalks. That's their criteria. I like a community with sidewalks. So that's kind of interesting. That's a sign that it's a more meaningful place to raise a family, just because it's got sidewalks. But so it is changing, but it's a very small segment of the typical population, I think.
Okay, so come to Michael. Arup is a big international company, and you obviously have projects all over the world. And what you've said tonight is that you take a great deal of care to connect those projects to their local contexts, and to whatever other issues you need to connect to. But operationally, when you're planning something in Jeddah or something in Nigeria, what is the process of that? What is the what sort of connectivity do you need with local professionals, and moreover with local communities and maybe local landowners and other interests? So how do you work operationally?
So we have an incredible amount of offices overseas. So on the two projects I showed you, one in Nairobi and one in Lagos, that was when I was with SOM, but the Arup team was the engineers, and they have local offices there. So Arup is located in many of these places. And when they're not, then we team with the local team. And I think that's really important in the work that we do, because we can fly in, we can take a quick tour, we can even stay there for a week or so, but we really can't get into the DNA of a place until we have a local person telling us, this is what, when they say this, they really mean that. When you look at this place, don't look at this, look at that. So you really need to understand the place from the eyes of a local person. The other thing we try to do is engage local students, so whenever we can. So sometimes it's very hard to talk to the existing community. The private sector clients don't want you to do that. So we say, okay, fine, let's get at least some students that can tell us what the local community is probably thinking. So that's another avenue that we use quite often. Particularly getting the perspective from the younger generation is also quite important. Particularly these countries are very much, the bell curves like this, the bottom of the age group in terms of their population profile. So yeah, we use a combination of our own teams on the ground and also other experts. And they can be engineers, planners, landscape architects, urban designers, or architects.
I mean, I think that's good to hear. I was reminded of the story of when Abercrombie produced the plan for Glasgow, that he went up there for dinner. And then before the last train back, he got his driver to just sort of scoot him around the outskirts of the city just to take a look. And then he went back to London and produced the plan. So it's good that those methods are not being used anymore.
Thank you very much. This is a fantastic lecture. I wanted to raise a problem with you, which is certainly a London problem, but I suspect it may be a problem elsewhere. You get these cities which become established with incredible radial transport systems, like we have in London. It's a bit out of date, a bit old-fashioned, but it works. And it can assemble an enormous labour force living over a huge number of regions. And this has served extremely well the office development industry of central London, the financial sector, the banks, the lawyers, the accountants, the consultants, and of course also architecture, engineering and building and everything. But this creates an enormous vested interest in sticking with this agglomeration. The successive London plans that we've had since the year 2000 have all had things in about becoming more polycentric.
Yeah.
Some little bits of it work, but mostly it doesn't. And a lot of it not working is because landowners and developers seem to be saying, no, we don't want to build this stuff out in the suburbs. We want to go on building workplaces in the centre. So it's an enormous amount of inertia. And after or during the COVID pandemic, when the British government was trying to think what on earth to do, one of the things it did, which I think is very representative of the power relations in London, it started this clearly crazy idea called Eat Out to Help Out, that they would subsidise restaurant meals in the centre of London to keep the restaurants going, but also to keep people coming into the centre and to support the real estate sector.
Yeah.
And the great champion of that was the Duke of Westminster, who was the richest man in England and whose ancestors had been owning land here since 1066 when their French kings invaded and stuff. So part of what we're up against is really an incredibly embedded inertia of institutional and other investors in the current structure. And do you have any good news for us from anywhere of how that can be unbundled?
That's a very good question. I think what I've seen recently in London is at least housing is getting densified further out. And that's a good sign that these clusters of higher density housing, I mean, just pop up all over the place. All of a sudden, I went out to here east this weekend, and I saw other things along the way from inside the city out. So at least you're getting some housing density, which now creates a critical mass of residents. That's number one. Number two, I think affordability is going to continue to be an issue, particularly for workplace environments. So I think a lot of workplace environments are going to shrink their footprint because more people are working from home or hybrid working, so they don't need as much floor space. So that's a big question for the office market in the core of any city, let alone London. So I think in order for it to work further out, I think you have to create employment clusters, and that's the big challenge. So what companies could be encouraged to leave the core to go out, because they may lose some workforce because the workforce right now is coming from all corners of life in London. So if you move them out to the southwest, to Twickenham, someone who lives in East London's got a horrible commute, so they're going to lose that employee now. So I think it'd probably work for smaller industries. Industries are looking for a more affordable footprint. Industries that need more space. So I think it would be interesting to do a study about targeting what are the right industries that could be encouraged to go. We're not talking. You're never going to get Apple isn't going to go out to South Greenwich or something when they had Battersea Power Station given to them pretty much. So you're not going to get the big multinationals, but smaller, finer grain employment clusters that group together. I mean, that's a victory right there, even if it's just a few hundred employees, I would say. So I think that's, I can't think of, well, there's lots of examples of that in the suburbs, in the States, which is very, Silicon Valley is like that, but their campuses, like like Stockley Park kind of thing, business parks. I don't think we want to sort of champion, but finding finer grain clusters of activity that you can kind of group together and coalesce and sort of sell that as an idea within a local borough could be a good way to go. The starting point.
Hi. I had a question. On one of the slides, it said, or a couple of slides, I think, I saw local plus global. And throughout the presentation, that kind of dynamic was something that I was thinking about, this relationship between local and global. And I kind of get what the local part is. What's the global part? In the sense, what I mean is, where does global expertise come from? Or global knowledge? Or Arab's sense of sort of global intelligence? Like, what is the global in that part of the story? And where does it come from?
Yeah, I mean, here obviously it was talking about how Jeddah specifically came about as part of this dynamic of a global gateway from the world to the Middle East. It was the gateway for all merchandise coming from the Orient and the West into Saudi and the rest of the region. So it was bringing with it global influences, in this case the trades, the migrants, the people going to the holy sites, but also very, using the local materials they had available to them and mixing that with global things that come in from the ships and whatnot. So that was very specific to that environment. But if I broaden your question a bit further, I think I find tremendous, I think we at Arab can, and others coming from London can help these places that don't know how to plan properly or to take the right direction in terms of all things we've been talking about. They need examples. They need to see how we've done the exact same thing they did, and we've come to the conclusion that that was not a great path to take. You're going to have all these social issues. You're going to have all these traffic issues. You're going to have all this carbon footprint issues. You're going to have all this environmental degradation if you go down this path. So here's what we've learned, and I think the more you show, not just from your home, but other places, you show this playing out in all places, they realize there's common ground. Instead of you just saying, oh, in London we do it this way, and you should do the same. When you show them more than one place, then they kind of understand, oh, you're not trying to sell something to me from London, but you're trying to awaken me to these issues. And a lot of these places, people are super smart. Also, they're seeing these things, if not on the internet, they're traveling. So they see them firsthand. So a lot of them are actually asking for this. Dan, I was just at King's Cross. It's amazing. How can we apply this thinking in this project here in Nairobi? So it's not as closed off as we think it may be. So their eyes are opening, but they don't know how to deliver. So tell me about how King's Cross happened. That's a 25-year story. City, developer, GLA, local borough, all kinds of complexities to make that project happen. The rail authority, but all these pieces came together and it creates this wonderful place because of this. You tell that story and then they kind of get it. So I think we have to figure a way to communicate the good things, even the bad things, but in a way that they feel it's applicable to them. If you can't apply it to their particular problem, you won't get very far. Hope that answered your question.
Okay, great. We've got 3 final questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the questioners to ask their questions, and then you'll be left with 3 questions to answer.
All right.
Okay. Let's try it that way.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is actually a follow-up to your question, to your answer. I come from Hong Kong, so I'm kind of familiar with developing new towns in a big city. So whenever we develop a new town, no matter with your company or other consultancy, we always say that we would like to build a self-contained new town. So have the job opportunities, 15 minutes walk, that is what we have been heard. But as you have mentioned, it always depends on the economic activities and the new job opportunities. So it does not always succeed. And as a planner, I believe you do not always know who will be willing to join in. So when you develop the new towns, how could you prevent yourself to be a not successful town planner? Because no one would like to be that. But then it seems to me that we have a chance, if not high chance, we maybe fail because we do not know who is willing to join us. Thank you.
Okay, so hold that thought. hold that thought, okay? Can you?
You
Yes?
remind me if I forget it.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay.
2 questions.
Hold up. One.
The
Come
first,
on. One.
the first one is to Dan and to Nick. In the lecture today, we've heard 5 lectures, which I would call master planning for dummies or master planning for policymakers. Are you confident that the wisdom that we've heard today about how to do a master plan is being embedded in your course? Okay?
That's a great question. That's a great question.
Right. The real question is, construct a hypothetical. You've got a very large commission to advise the leader of Milton Keynes on what to do with his city. And it's an important commission for you, and you've already won it. You're familiar with central Milton Keynes because Abuja was designed on the same principles as central Milton Keynes. And the challenge, the theme running through your entire lecture is we need to densify, intensify our suburban areas. And Milton Keynes is a giant suburb in many ways. If you lead with that on your first day, there won't be a second day, because the leader of Milton Keynes is completely opposed to such proposals, number one. And number two, the reason he is because he knows his constituents don't want it. What advice will you give him?
Okay, those are your 3 questions.
That's my 3, okay.
Those are the 3.
Well, one's for you. I got 2.
I'll give it a go. You
I've got 2,
start,
you've
and I'll
got
give it a go. Go on.
To your point, I think we can never predict everything. And I think what you try to do is to lay out a series of principles and strategies that can be adopted and adjusted. So we have to promote and think about how to plan resilience in our planning. A lot of if-then scenarios, a lot of choices, A, B, and C alternatives, whether it be sea level rise is going to be small, medium, or large. Well, you need 3 strategies for protecting your ground and how you're going to create that. And in terms of the employment question you're asking, same thing. So I think you try to say, here are 3 directions of travel to investigate based on our analysis of the economic situation around us. What part of the competition can we grab? Be reasonable about it. Don't also be honest with the client. Like on these projects in Morocco, the client didn't realize until we showed them, you only need half of your site for the next 25 years. They're like, huh? We just expanded and bought all this other land. I said, well, you didn't have to. And the economic projections show that. And only if you do these 5 things will you get even close to that projection. So you really have to work hard to create an ecosystem around the campus there to make those things happen. So I think it's about being honest with them, with yourself, and also being quite frank to say, hey, I didn't predict that, but let's go with the flow and let's come back at it. I think also encouraging your clients to continue to have a dialogue with you across time. These things really evolve and change every 5 years. They need to be updated, and kind of all kinds of interrupters come into the mix. So I think being very flexible and honest, reasonable. If they want a projection, you give them sort of an aggressive one, yes, but a reasonable one and somewhere in between. So you know, and you show it to scale on a plan. If this happens, this is what you're looking at. And if that happens, great, but don't forget that this is at least something you can hopefully bank on. So, I mean, even any sort of economist or even market advisor would tell you they can't predict. They can just kind of tell you the market today you could be tracked this, but you have a 10-year construction program. Who knows in 10 years where you're going to be? So it's really challenging. Our work is super challenging along those ways, super unpredictable. Yeah. So I think simple frameworks that can adjust, that can change. Even land use can be swapped out. Density can change. These are the things we have to keep in mind. Yeah. Milton Keynes. So the leader must have changed, because the last I saw Milton Keynes, they're proposing all these towers in this core. So it sounds like there's a change of heart there. So what I would do first is I would sit down and listen I wouldn't propose anything without listening to what they're saying and what the leader's saying, what the constituents are saying, and then I'd kind of go with the flow and see, okay, what can I make of the situation? So, and I would try to unpick the point of what is density for this person? What is good density, what's bad density, and try to understand what they mean by that fear of intensifying their town. And maybe that is applied to certain areas, but not the whole town. So maybe there's a way to navigate through what they're really saying and what they really mean, and how to logically apply it in their situation. I think Milton Keynes needs a university, by the way. It needs that university, which I think is dead now. They need that for anything else to happen there. They're getting some residual sort of fintech and other technology clusters that are sort of complementing the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, but I think they need an academic anchor to kind of really push the next level. I don't know much about the area outside of the core. I really only know the core. So I bet some of their nervousness has to do with those residential neighborhoods around the core, I would think. And then, so that's just about reassuring them we're not proposing a tower or a lot of density or a kind of a product that's going to bring people that they're worried about coming. I don't know. It's really about a dialogue you have to have with them to kind of see where you would take it.
You'll make it to the third day.
Okay. Well, I'll take that.
So on your second or your first question, Lee, we cover all the bases. Yeah, that's my stock answer. But we have the benefit of people like Dan to provide us with the sorts of insights that he's provided us with this evening. So I think together, the master plan for dummies, I think was your phrase. I wouldn't quite put it that way, but I think we cover the bases and we have the benefit of these insights. So hopefully we do a reasonable job of covering these issues.
I laugh because my interview for Arab, you go through like 3 or 4 interviews to be a director there. The last one was with 2 of the board directors, and they were like preeminent engineers in the world. After I gave the seminar talk, they said, I just got a master plan for dummies, and I laughed. Thank you very much. So I laughed at you.
It's a good phrase. It's a good phrase. Right, we're done. Thank you very much, Dan, for a wonderful talk, and we'll thank you again.
Pleasure to be here.